understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is time for the podcast. And John, I'm home. I knew you.
Thank God, Mark. Thank God you're home.
I knew you were missing me.
You came home for a hug.
I came home for, exactly. But as I said, if you do get a chance, John, really, I couldn't recommend Quebec more strong. It's a really fascinating place.
It feels like one of those kind of places, not only the cities, but if I went to Canada, I think I'd like to go there for a long time and do a bit of forest bathing.
Forest bathing. I think forest bathing, well, it's just the sheer size. I think Quebec province is 4 times the size of France.
Oh, right,
so
okay.
It's kind of enormous, right?
Wow, yeah.
It's enormous. And then, of course, you go further north and you have all the Inuit territories, which are just vast. Anyway, so Canada, we're going to do a podcast today, John, on something that really shocked me about Canada.
Right.
And it's something that I saw in the United States as well the year before. We mentioned it very, very briefly when we were talking to Evan Solomon. And it is the opioid epidemic in Canada.
Yeah.
So Ottawa, for example, is the capital city of one of the wealthiest countries in the world. You know, this is Canada. This is caring Canada. This is not like vengeful America. This is caring Canada. It's, you know, this is the home of Margaret Atwood and Neil Young. Amazing welfare system, amazing health system, enormous material resources, like amazing resources, right? And home to, as we talked last week, thousands and thousands of Irish people, right? People go there, right? And yet, in an area called the Markets, which is the sort of kind of centre of Ottawa. So again, you're talking about 200 metres from the Canadian Parliament. There are just zombies everywhere. Lost addicts. Same in Quebec City. Like huge areas that have been entirely populated by opioid addicts who are, it's like a cross between Mad Max and Trainspotting. Like if you could imagine, right? And I just sat there and I thought, you know, if these drugs, when we talk about them, if these drugs come to Ireland, fentanyl, Oxycontin, synthetic opioids, all that stuff, I mean, God help us, they have destroyed. I mean, I saw this as a place last year. Remember this time last year I was in Vancouver doing that TED talk I did. And again, Vancouver, everyone says it's a beautiful city and it's got this, and it has. You'd love great outdoors, it's on the Pacific, all that sort of stuff. You got the Rockies, you got all sorts of things going on, right? And there's an area called East Hastings, which is, again, a number of blocks, not just one street. And it is entirely rammed with these unbelievably addicted people. And it's so depressing. And, you know when you're jet lagged, you get up early. Yeah. So, you get up about 5 or 6 and you kind of bolt upright in the bed, say, what am I going to do? I'll go for a stroll. See the city as it wakes up. Yeah. And I went down and rather than taking in Vancouver, and I did the same thing in Ottawa, rather than taking the left, I took the right. And you see these tent cities. I know people are talking about tents now in Ireland, right? But these tent cities waking up in the morning. And it is like a scene from Dante's Inferno. It is like, it's the 9th circle of hell. Yeah. And maybe it's even changed my views on drug legalization, because these people need to be protected. Yeah. You know, it's an extraordinary story. I mean, you've seen it in San Francisco as well.
Well, I always looked on San Francisco, because I was there in the 1990s, as my favorite city in the States. Yeah. And I went back in 2019 for a conference and I was really looking forward to it. Now, the weekend I was there, it was horrible weather, lashing rain. So the streets are empty, but they were packed with homeless and tents. And I was gobsmacked, absolutely gobsmacked at how much the city had changed. And the weird thing was the kind of juxtaposition of kind of these, as you say, zombies and ghosts walking around the streets that are lined with these gleaming glass and steel tech bro buildings.
Yes, exactly. Of course, that's San Francisco.
Yeah, it was just incredible.
Yeah.
But are you saying then that in Canada it's new? I know it's been building up in America for a while.
It's again, maybe I've been highly sensitized to this because I'm also reading that book I mentioned last week, the Barbara Kingsolver book called Damon Copperhead.
Oh, yes,
right? Yeah. Which is again about poverty in Appalachia, but also where poverty fuses with drug addiction. Right. Yeah. So it seems that in the 1930s, opioids were declared illegal in the United States because there were just so many opium addicts, and it was becoming a problem for the Americans. So for about a 40-year period, the Americans and American pharmaceutical companies were banned from producing opioids of any great significance, except for purely very restricted medical use, pain management, particularly for cancer patients.
Yeah, yeah.
But then in the 1990s, that changed, and certain companies lobbied American governments, and they lobbied the regulator. And I think the story is well told. I think there was a Netflix documentary, wasn't it?
Oh, there's actually been quite a few. There was Dope Sick.
Yeah,
and then
which is a very good one.
Yeah, it was really good. And then there was the one I actually watched quite recently with Matthew Broderick in it, Painkiller. And it was the story of Purdue and the Sackler family.
Yeah. So
and just how, I mean, the story of that, like, you can't help but get angry as that story unfolds. The pure greed that was driving all of that, and the deliberate misinformation that they were doing. Just, it was all about sales. Just sell the drugs.
It's the economics of prohibition. Yeah. It's the economics of big pharma. And it's also the economics of this crazy obsession with shareholder value.
Yes.
So that everything can be justified by the quarterly profit number, which is something that we spoke with Nick Hanauer about, which was an idea brought in by Milton Friedman, adopted by Jack Welch, who I worked for. Yeah. He was the head of GE, and became very much the mantra of Wall Street. So every quoted American company has this, and Irish company, has this extraordinary terror with the quarterly results. And the quarterly results have to generate year on year and quarter increases in profit. Yeah. And the only way you can do that when the economy is growing at 2%, if you think about it, right? The economy is growing at 2%, right? How can you increase profits quarter by quarter? You can only do this by overselling or undercutting costs or a combination of both and doing it all the time. And anybody who works in a large corporation, if you talk to them, they're terrorized by the quarterly results, the sales results, right? Yeah. So everything has to sell. So this Oxycontin fentanyl discussion we're going to have is a sort of a confluence of where addiction meets homelessness, meets poverty, and meets inequality, best expressed by shareholder value. And so it's when you try to gain a little bit of altitude from the entire thing, and you look down and say, okay, what bits of this jigsaw are working all the time? This is when you find, so that Dope Sick or Painkiller is basically the Sackler family come in. Yeah. Drug company, I think it's called Purdue. Purdue. And they manage to bribe, in effect, the regulator to make available opioids, which are highly, highly, highly addictive. And they manage to get, as always is the case, very spurious research. Which concludes casually that, well, not that many people get addicted. Yeah. They continue to use this again and again and again. It bashes down the regulator's door. And the problem with the regulator, and I noticed this years ago when I worked in Ireland in the central bank, is that so many of the people in the regulator or inside the central bank ended up working in the banks. Right?
Yes, because
they got paid more. So it's a bit like, it says, how do you make a cop corrupt? You pay him less, then you pay the gangster. Yeah,
the gamekeeper turned poacher.
Exactly. Yeah. So imagine there's the same fusion in pharma. So people who work in big pharma, chemists, all those sort of people, they naturally will be gravitating towards the regulator because they're the only people who can regulate because they can understand the drugs, right? So there's this fusion. There's this. It's a kind of there's no separation of powers. And then, of course, you have shareholder value comes in and it's basically sell. The doctors are then enlisted. It's an extraordinary story because doctors are the Hippocratic oath, do no evil, right? Yeah. So in a way, we look at doctors, and I do, as our protectors. When I go to the doctor, there's a certain amount of anxiety at our age, John, given our behavior, but there's also a certain amount of, okay, I'm in a safe space here. This person knows what they're talking about. They can either assuage me, but they're there to protect me. Right? They're there to if the news is bad, to give it. But they're there to say, look, don't worry about this. We've got this. So imagine a situation where the last line of defense for the patient, the doctors, are enlisted in what is in effect a drug cartel. Yeah. This is exactly what it is. It's a drug cartel selling opium. legally.
But the thing about that is, and what that program Painkiller portrayed really, really well, was that it's not always the junkie on the street, as it were, the ne'er-do-well. It is the kind of the normal head
I'm
who
looking at
breaks
you
his
with your back pain. I'm looking at you.
I know my
By the way, John's got back pain at the moment, right? And I'm looking at you and you're moving contortedly, right?
I get comfortable,
so imagine you go to the doctor and you say, look, I've a pain in my back and it's like, I've had it for a couple of weeks and it's, I can't sleep properly. And they say, take this pill.
Yeah.
And straight away, the pain disappears.
Yeah.
So you're like, I want more of that.
Yeah.
I want more of that. And then, of course, it's highly, highly addictive. And we know that, our bodies respond to morphine in the most bizarre way.
Yeah.
And we just want it, we want it. And then you're hooked. And the first iteration of this opioid epidemic is about 1995 to about 2005, John, or maybe 1995 to about 2000.
Yeah.
That Sackler family, their company gets the license to produce Oxycontin, right? So from 1997 to 2002, Oxycontin prescriptions in the United States increased 670,000 to 6.2 million a year.
Wow. Yeah. God.
So just think about the amount of addicts that's creating. And it is across the entire population. Right?
Yeah.
Since then, nearly 700,000 people have died of opioid overdoses. 700,000. It's a phenomenal amount, right? Now, and these people I saw in Ottawa and in Quebec, that's just the last line of this problem.
But it's also the ripple effect, not just the particular victim, but the ripple effect in the families and society.
I just looked at these. I looked at this and I just thought, these were kids. They were my kids' age, right? And I've always had a very tolerant attitude to drugs, to drug taking, to people do whatever they want. I've always been very much on the liberal side, almost the libertarian side. You're an adult, do what you want. But when you see their faces and they're haunted and they're scared and they're alone, you think, Jesus.
So have you changed your view entirely?
Well, I'm going to come back to the economics of it, of economics of prohibition. Second surge of this epidemic is around 2000, when you see overdose deaths begin to double in the United States.
Right.
From 3 per 100,000 to 7 per 100,000, right? And again, this is so much more potent than heroin, this stuff, right? The third phase now is the synthetic opioids, where you're getting the mass production of these opioids all around the States, but mainly outside the States as well.
Yeah.
And it's actually becoming part of the drug culture. But again, I'll just give you, from 2015 to 2020, the rate of opioid-involved overdose deaths doubled. So people are dying far more from fentanyl than heroin. Far, far more at this stage, right? And so we've looked at shareholder value.
Yeah.
So this is pushing this stuff. We've looked at the fact that the regulator is the poacher turned gamekeeper, that they're just too close, which is why, of course, pharma companies, and I'm not talking about all pharma companies, always take out people on golf trips and whatever. It's a business, right?
Yes. And
they take out doctors and all that sort of. Then you look at the doctors themselves, who are the last line of defense, they become enlisted. And I think in lots of these cases, doctors themselves were unbelievably skeptical. But in some cases they weren't, because maybe you're a doctor in an overstretched, let's say, small clinic, right? And you've seen people in pain, and you've seen what pain does to people, and you've tried to figure out pain management over your life, and then somebody comes with a pill, and you think, wow, this works. So you see the relief on the sides of, because in a surgery, I presume, patients become mates of doctors. Doctors want to help them. So
you have a certain relationship with your doctor.
But the problem is, in this case, the doctors become the dealers, which is extraordinary. And then, of course, because it's much more potent than heroin, people who used to be heroin addicts take fentanyl. Yeah. Because it's much stronger and you need much less of it, right, to get the same buzz. And then, of course, it becomes part of the global drug business. And the global drug business, in this case, seems to be an unusual triangle where in the very, very remote parts of China, factories are making this drug and they're exporting it or its compounds to Mexico, where the once coke cartels now realize, wow, this is far more profitable for us. Yeah. Because if you imagine, because it's much more potent, you have to move much less of it physically to generate the same amount of cash. So it becomes almost de-risked for the drug cartel. Because the bulkier the drug, the harder it is to move. Whereas this stuff is so potent that even moving a tiny bit of it generates enormous profits. And then you're into the narcos trade. And that's what's happening in the United States,
You know, I was reading that about how China are supplying the precursor chemicals for fentanyl and supplying them to Mexico. They're actually offering a kind of a VAT discount for the for the manufacturers in China, because drugs are completely illegal in China, and as long as they're not sold in China, you can do whatever you want. In fact, we will give you a discount and almost promote it for you, is what they're doing. That's why Biden was over talking to Xi about this in January, specifically about providing fentanyl precursors to Mexico. But then I was thinking, and I was getting my conspiracy hat on.
John, I love your conspiracy hat. It's like, it is a hat. And it's not that it's a physical hat, but it's an intellectual hat that I see when he puts it on his head. His eyes brighten up a wee bit more. There's all sorts of, you can imagine the synapses are just sparking up madly, right? It's like literally a rush of blood to the head.
But here's
where are you taking me? Where are you taking me?
But I was thinking back, and we actually did a podcast on this quite a while ago, on the 100 years of humiliation.
Oh, the Chinese,
following the Opium Wars, where Britain...
1840s, 1850s,
flooded China with heroin, with opium.
Yeah.
From Afghanistan.
Just to give you a little background on that, what happened was the British in India and in Afghanistan and all around the British Empire, what they really, really wanted to do was sell the Chinese Empire, which opened up something. And when they turned up with their shoddy second-rate goods, the Chinese said, we don't want anything.
Yeah.
Right? This is we did the podcast about Shanghai.
Yes.
So it was about getting licenses to trade with the Chinese. And I think we also related to the Meiji Restoration in Japan, because the Japs saw what happened in China and they said, that ain't going to happen to us.
Yes.
Right? So the Chinese said, no, we don't want anything. And particularly the British wanted to export tea, right? From their plantations in India. What they called Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and India. And the Chinese said, no, we don't want it. We have enough of our own stuff. So the Brits generated a market in heroin. It's amazing. From northern India and from Afghanistan.
It's incredibly cynical, isn't it?
And they in effect injected heroin into China. Yeah. And they called it the Opium Wars. And this is where the expression gunboat diplomacy comes up as well.
Yeah.
So they'd kind of push the opium and then they'd have a gunboat off Hong Kong, which was saying, if you Chinese people don't... And it created an entire generation of addicts in China. And their idea was to undermine the Chinese, which they did. And you're right. So Chinese people see through this perspective.
Yeah, so my conspiracy theory, and maybe it's not a conspiracy at all, but what I was thinking was that, the Chinese tend to play the long game.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a little bit of payback.
As your man said, I think it was it Mao, when he was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? He said, it's too early to tell.
Nice.
Yeah. It's a great expression.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think conspiracy theories, if you stand back and say, if part of the Chinese grand plan is to usurp the United States and is to beat the United States, well, you can beat the United States in many ways. You can beat them militarily.
Yeah.
You can beat them economically.
Yeah.
Even this week, the Americans have slapped a 100% tariff on electric vehicles coming from China because Joe Biden's administration has invested so much in green technology, electric vehicles, batteries, all that kind of stuff, right? That they realize that the Chinese will be able to beat them on price in the car market, as they are doing, as we spoke about Tesla and Elon Musk the other day. And surprise, Elon Musk was over in China. Discussing just this. So you can beat them economically, and that's the typical tariff war and trade wars and exchange rates and all that good stuff.
Cyber wars as well.
Cyber wars, the chip war, that the Chinese are involved in. You can beat them, but you can also destroy America socially. That's the thing.
Yeah.
You can destroy them with drugs. And why is it? It's because the drug addiction is also a massive, massive part of the overall social infrastructure of the United States. And it's the same here, I mean, there is a proportion of people who get off their heads and want to get off their heads. There's also a proportion of people for whom every day is so bleak that their economic prospects in Dublin, all over Ireland, all over the West, that every single day is so bleak and they are diminished by, and I use the word diminished, by poverty. People are diminished by poverty. And you get off your head because it's so dark. So the world is so dark. And if you think that the inequality, the lack of opportunity, the lack of hope in the United States, in huge, huge sections, make drug addiction more likely. They don't make it an absolute certainty, but they make it more likely.
Yeah.
And then if you superimpose on that the housing crisis, which is evident in the United States, in Canada, in Ireland and all that, what you have then is you cede large parts of the public realm to people who are privately addicted. And this is what we're seeing in these cities.
Yeah, I mean, like housing seems to be the root of many problems in the Western world in particular. But let's come back after a bit of this and talk about the economics of prohibition and the drugs trade. The one thing I've noticed, Mac, in the last couple of years in particular is the amount of cheap cocaine. Like just getting away from fentanyl in Dublin and across the country. It is everywhere. And I think possibly what might be fueling part of this is, the law of unintended consequences, where they keep jacking up tax and prices on alcohol. So kids don't go to bars anymore because you can't go in there and buy a £6 pint of Guinness or £8 or a £10 pint of Guinness when it's cheaper to, as you say, get off your head on a cheap bag of cocaine. Yeah. And that seems to be happening.
Maybe.
It's cheaper, maybe.
It is. I mean, I think the thing about it is it's like relative prices, right? To go back to the economics of it, always create the incentive. So let's have a look. The thing is that humans have been getting off their heads for many thousands of years. For example, magic mushrooms have been found in North African murals dating back 9,000 to 7,000 years before Christ. So a long, long time ago. Opium, first cultivated by our friends the Sumerians in 3,400 BC. Ancient users of drugs always include Greeks, Romans, Indians, Egyptians, Assyrians. So a thing called
Jesus walking across water, all the lads are...
all there, exactly.
their heads going, look at your man.
Ancient Egyptians used to talk about this plant called blue lotus that they used to love, right? So basically, humans have been getting off their heads for thousands of years. It's part of the human condition to explore mind-altering drugs and psychiatrics or psychedelics and all that sort of stuff. So we've been doing this for a long time. People have been smoking hash for years. Yeah. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years, right? And again, you see it, all this sort of stuff it's in the Odyssey, it's in Homer. So that's the first thing. So it's always been a way. However, you're right about the relative prices. Is if you make something cheaper than the generic drug, alcohol, let's say, for example, then of course you make it much more available. But I think it's a supply creating its own demand idea. So I think it's just the enormous supply coming into the country of coke, and then it's all cut up to all sorts of carry-on, right? Yeah. You can't go into the jacks of any suburban bar these days without two lads coming out of the cubicle, and they're not riding.
Maybe they are,
but they're doing lines of banger. But let's look at the economics of prohibition, right? Because I would have always had the view, and it might have even changed in the last 36 hours, that prohibition always fails, that the so-called war on drugs has failed in the sense that there are more drugs available cheaper than ever before. So the amount of money that's going in the war on drugs on trying to stop the supply has failed spectacularly. And then I would have always thought that if you look at prohibition in the States, for example, booze prohibition in the 1920s, all it did is it pushed the booze business underground. Yeah. And ironically, the quality of the booze deteriorated dramatically because people started making hooch, and hooch was methylated spirits, right? So in a sense, the fact that booze was illegal made it even more dangerous. But then, and you also know, obviously, is that as long as the profits from drugs are enormous, you'll get drug gangs. As long as you get drug gangs, the way in which you enforce contracts in that world, because it's illegal, is with guns, right? As we're seeing in Dublin. So you get drug violence. Then you think, okay, as long as the supply is in some way controlled by the drug gangs, the price will increase. So if the price increases, then the addicts need to get their money from somewhere. So crime increases. So you need more cops. So you need, for example, our prisons are just full of people who shouldn't be there. And I remember this because I went into Mountjoy years and years ago to teach a bit of economics. And, there was just a lot of addicted men who shouldn't have been in prison. They just had an addiction problem. But they're in prison and then they become violent and then they get into the whole situation. So my view has always been, look, the economics of prohibition are very, very straightforward. It doesn't work, and therefore you should legalize everything. When I was
never comfortable with that.
I know you were never comfortable with it. I always thought, and I always think you should legalize weed and all these sort of things.
Yeah.
People say, it's a gateway drug. Well, actually, cigarettes are the gateway drug.
Yeah.
Like most people who smoke weed started smoking fags, and then it moved on from there. But having seen these misfortunes, these poor people in Canada last weekend, I just said to myself, they have to be protected. You can't allow this stuff on the streets. It's just too dangerous. And it's destroying too many lives, and it's creating a multitude, if you want to be really utilitarian about it, like economics about it, it's creating a multitude of attendant other problems, social problems, crime, all that sort of stuff, right? But at its core, people need to be protected from this stuff. Now, is there an argument to say that legalizing these drugs would be non-problematic? Well, we've already seen that because Oxycontin is legal, right? Fentanyl is legal in certain areas. We've seen what happens when you make it legal. You create an enormous amount of addicts. And then when you take those drugs off the market, those addicts go onto heroin.
So then is this crisis a failure of economic policy and probably ultimately a symptom of libertarian free market economics? Given that incentivizes the likes of Purdue and the opioid crisis in particular, as opposed to... I think
you're right. I think there's a huge amount of things going on here. Okay, so we've spoken a bit about the social problems. We've spoken about the linked and interrelated dilemmas of crime, health, hopelessness, all that sort of stuff. But if you want to be very economic about it, John, this is all about elasticity. Okay, so there's a concept in economics called elasticity of demand. Right. And what it means, so the price elasticity of demand means the responsiveness of the demand to a change in price.
Okay.
So, for example, a normal good, right? At some stage, the increase in the price will have a change in the amount demanded. Because the person will say, hold on a second, prices have gone through the roof. I'm going to buy either something else or I'm not going to buy at all. And that's a function of, one, their income, and number two, the substitutes that exist out there for that good, right? For anything at all, right? So you take, say, a car, right? At a certain stage, if you jack up the price of an average car, not a status good, but an average car, people will say, you know what, I'm not going to buy that Volkswagen, I'll buy a Toyota. So we know that, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm not going to buy that Volkswagen at all, right?
Or Tesla.
Exactly. The price of Tesla's falling now dramatically, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to addiction, there is something called perfectly inelastic. And what it means is, and this is the weird thing, so if you're an addict, the change in the price has no real impact on your demand because your demand is not a choice you're making. You're an addicted person,
you just want it regardless.
So I'll give you an example. The reason at every budget in Ireland, the old reliables are taxed is because the price elasticity of demand is quite inelastic, i.e. the demand doesn't really change. So booze and fags, the great example, right? People still drink and they still smoke. So the government says that's an easy win. So now let's go and look at the drug issue. If you're an addict, you have an infinite elastic response to prices. Now that, for the supplier of drugs, is bonanza. So it means the prices go down, go up.
Yeah.
And the addicts still require the cash to buy the drug.
It's like the oil companies. When the price of oil goes up, they are on a big boom. Their profits boom away. And
that's exactly what has happened in the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you mentioned the oil companies. So if we come back, so the oil companies are a cartel. They always have been.
Yeah.
They were called the Seven Sisters in the old days, right? So basically what the oil companies did was the prices went up through OPEC. They said, okay, we'll supply this, you supply that. But in effect, we'll all make money. This is very much, the drug cartel is very much along the lines of oil companies, right? Now, and I say this advisedly.
Yeah.
As you can hear, the actual writs going in, and the Dave McWilliams podcast is sunk under a sea of litigation. Okay.
I heard the post box there.
David McWilliams versus Texaco, right? The people versus Texaco. So let's come back to the idea. The interaction of mendacious corporate governments, which is a company like the likes of Purdue, actively pushing drugs that they know are highly addictive on people that they know are highly vulnerable.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. Second thing is you then internationalize that market by, it's been pushed underground in America, but what you do is you go to China, you use the existing drug cartel infrastructure to do exactly what they were doing. The Sinaloa cartel was doing with weed 20 years ago, exactly the same thing. And you have in the United States and Canada and in Western Europe, a growing disenfranchised underclass of addicted people who are on the streets. Yes, because they're addicts, but also because there's no accommodation for them. You put those together and you have a perfect storm. And what I saw in Canada and what you see in North America, and what if we're not careful, you'll see here, is a perfect storm where addiction meets greed, meets criminality, and, to put an economic gloss on it, meets the price elasticity of demand, which means that the profits are enormous, the incentives are enormous, and then nobody's got any reason to change. And who pays the bill? The addicts, their family, and society in general.